Myron Kuropas from Chicago, former Special Assistant for Ethnic Affairs to President Gerald Ford, to give us his perspective on the U.S. experience.
Thank you. What I'd like to do as a wrap-up is to talk a little bit about the book Quiet Neighbors, to talk about the fact that some of the problems that we Ukrainians have in the United States we brought upon ourselves, and to urge you not to repeat our own mistakes by pointing out what those mistakes were. Had the Soviet Union paid a once highly placed and visible U.S. government official to write a book aimed at discrediting anti-communism among Americans of Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian descent, especially those who fled communist oppression after World War II, it would have received more than its money's worth from Alan J. Ryan, Jr., former director of the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations and the author of Quiet Neighbors, Prosecuting Nazi War Criminals in America. Ryan would argue that the major purpose of his book is to alert Americans to the thousands, and he writes boatload after boatload, of Nazi war criminals who came to the United States after World War II, and to justify OSI's efforts to prosecute and to deport them. I maintain that Ryan has an entirely different purpose. I believe that Ryan wants to cast a long, dark shadow of doubt over the European past of all displaced persons, to question the integrity of those humanitarian Americans who assisted them in their flight from Soviet Union, and to resurrect the spurious notion that the U.S. and the USSR were World War II allies, both of whom were equally dedicated to the destruction of Nazism. Ryan writes that some 116,000 Baltic and Ukrainian DPs and 53,000 Volkdeutsch came to the United States after World War II. Then he writes, if even 5% of those people had taken part in the persecution of Jews, then over 8,000 Nazi war criminals are here. After admitting that, quote, such estimates are hardly scientific, indeed, he writes, they are speculation dressed in very light clothing, Ryan nevertheless reaches the incredible conclusion that these numbers, quote, give a certain perspective to the question of how many Nazi persecutors came to the United States, end quote. Although Ryan offers no documentation for his 5% figure, it is precisely this type of, quote, rigorous documentation that the book jacket lauds and around which Ryan builds his case. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, Ryan writes, quote, was a brazenly discriminatory piece of legislation written exclusively to exclude as many concentration camp survivors as possible and to include as many Baltic and Ukrainian and ethnic German Volkdeutsch as it could get away with. Had Congress tried to design a law that would extend the Statue of Liberty's hand to the followers and practitioners of Nazism, it could not have done much better than this without coming right out and saying so, end quote. Ryan reaches this outrageous conclusion by arguing that, quote, preferences went to groups with known patterns of collaboration, and that in order to process as many as possible quickly, individual investigations were unreliable. Both of his theses are fallacious. That some Ukrainians and Balts collaborated with Germany is undeniable, but their numbers were significantly smaller than those of the Italians, who collaborated with Hitler all through the war, the Soviets, who actively collaborated with Hitler between 1939 and 1941, the Vichy Frenchmen, who willingly placed their entire government under Nazi rule and provided human and material resources to the German war effort, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Norwegians, and the Danes, all of whom had enthusiastic fascist parties both before and during the Nazi occupation. The major difference was that while Western Europe regained its independence after the war, the people of Eastern Europe remained enslaved. And as a result, Western Europe had few refugees, while Eastern Europe had millions. Preference in the United States was given to those groups who had suffered twice, first under the Soviets and then under the Nazis. Ryan never mentions this in his discussion of displaced persons, leaving the distinct impression that the displaced persons fled their homelands with the Germans because they were supportive of the Nazi cause and not because, having once tasted life under Soviet rule, they were willing to leave everything behind in order not to live under Moscow's hand. Ryan, of course, somewhat reluctantly admits that it would be wrong to leave the impression, as he puts it, that a majority of Ukrainian, Baltic, or Folkdeutsch immigrants had taken part in Nazi crimes. The number who had actually taken part in persecution, he writes, as opposed to those who had been merely sympathizers, was almost certainly a small part. And then he adds this qualifier, although no one will ever know how small. The impression left with the uninformed reader is that there were many Ukrainian and Baltic Nazi sympathizers in Europe, that those who actually persecuted Jews were probably in the minority, but that the size of this minority will never be known. Ryan makes clear that he is only interested in the persecutors who live in the United States and not the sympathizers. His message to the uninformed American is this: even if the OSI has not identified the Ukrainian or Balt who lives in your neighborhood, that Ukrainian or Balt may still be not a Nazi criminal, but at least a Nazi sympathizer. Ryan offers little evidence to substantiate his allegation that investigations of displaced persons in Europe were lax. It is a matter of record that every applicant under the Displaced Persons Act was checked by the FBI, the Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army, which included, by the way, 21 separate investigative steps, the OSS, the Provost Marshal General of the U.S. Army in Germany, the Berlin Document Center, the Fingerprint Center in Heidelberg, various consular officers, especially assigned to the DP program, the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the Department of Justice stationed overseas, and special U.S. investigators assigned to screen escapees from communist countries. Although it is possible that some war criminals could make it through this network, such an elaborate system can hardly be called cursory and unreliable, which is what Ryan called it. Nor is there any truth to Ryan's suggestion that the provision in the DP Act, which allocated 30% of the slots to farmers, was put into the legislation specifically to favor Ukrainians. In reality, the provision was inserted because few Americans were willing to work on farms after World War II. Wages were low and farm jobs went begging. Responding to veterans' fears that the DPs would compete with them for jobs in the cities, and this was the major reason why the American Legion was opposed to the DP Act, Congress hit upon the farming proviso as a kind of compromise. Few Ukrainians were agricultural workers, and only those who couldn't find sponsors elsewhere ended up on farms. Another serious criticism of Alan Ryan's book is that it subtly but unmistakably helps legitimize the Soviet perspective regarding displaced persons, World War II, and the freedom aspirations of Ukrainians and Balts. Ryan points out that some Americans were opposed to the DP Act because they feared the United States would become a haven for former Nazis, and provides citations from the congressional record, the New York Times, and the New York Post to substantiate his point. What Ryan fails to mention, however, is the fact that the most vociferous opponents of the DP Act were America's communists, who were among the first to indiscriminately label all refugees from communist terror as, quote, Nazi collaborators. He also chooses to ignore the results of a special subcommittee report of the House Committee on the Judiciary entitled Displaced Persons in Europe and Their Resettlement in the United States, submitted to Congress on January 20th, 1950. Supported by staff experts, Subcommittee members visited various DP camps, making personal contacts and unscheduled visits, holding hearings with free exchange of questions and answers, and attending briefings by military and civilian personnel. Investigating charges of widespread fraud, falsification and forging of documents by prospective DPs, the subcommittee reported that, quote, the number of screening agencies, screening sessions, interrogations, and checks that a displaced person must pass before reaching the United States is so extensive that the chance of a fraudulent statement or a forged document to slip through is practically nil, end quote. Based on our findings, subcommittee members concluded that, quote, the majority of allegations regarding misrepresentation can be safely classified either as rumors or deliberate misrepresentation intended to serve a definite purpose, end quote. Ryan's bias is further revealed when he describes America's fear of communism immediately after the war as, quote, hysterical overreaction. While there were excesses, especially in the outrageous allegations of Senator Joseph McCarthy, the United States was hardly overreacting to the Soviets when Soviet forces refused to leave Eastern Europe and permit free elections as they had promised to do. Greece was in danger of falling to Soviet-backed communist partisans. The Soviets blockaded U.S. highway and railroad access to Berlin. Soviet-backed North Korea invaded South Korea, and Soviet spies were stealing our atomic secrets. Another example of Ryan's leanings is his description of the negotiations which led to Soviet Procurator General Roman Rudenko's agreement to supply documents and witnesses to the OSI. The Soviets, writes Ryan, were somewhat annoyed, quote, that their earlier efforts to supply information on Nazi criminals in the United States were seemingly ignored by American authorities. Since the war, Rudenko reminded Ryan, the Soviets held many trials, but the United States held none. Ryan admitted this, and his compatriots reminded Rudenko of the U.S.-USSR alliance during World War II, and writes Ryan, quote, the mood became noticeably more relaxed. We were no longer the Soviet Union's 1980 adversary. We were representing Russia's wartime ally, the common ally of the Hitlerites, end quote. Ryan either ignores or is totally unaware of the fact that the Soviets adored the Hitlerites and became America's wartime ally only because the Hitlerites didn't trust them and invaded the Soviet Union in a surprise attack. A tragic irony, hopelessly lost on Ryan, is that every one of the land grabs the Soviets initiated while allied with the Hitlerites, including what Ryan refers to in quotation marks as, quote, the forced incorporation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, remained in their possession at the end of the war. The Soviets were not fighting Hitlerism to destroy it, but to take its place. And what about the witnesses the Soviets produced for Ryan? Were any of them allowed to testify in the United States? Of course not. All depositions, as has already been stated, had to be videotaped in the Soviet Union, and all testimony was translated into Russian, quote, for official purposes. And who were these witnesses? Ryan writes that many were former Nazi collaborators who had been tried by the Soviets, had served sentences in jail, and he says somewhere between 3 to 8 years, and had long since been released and resumed their lives in the Soviet Union and in Soviet society. Known Nazi collaborators sentenced and released after only 3 years during Stalin's time. If you believe that, then you believe in the tooth fairy. Throughout his book, Ryan reserves pejoratives such as brutal and bestial almost exclusively for Ukrainians. As Professor Taras Funchak has pointed out in his review of Quiet Neighbors, Ryan is not above distorting citations to attribute bloodthirstiness to Ukrainians when the actual reference, Professor Raoul Hilberg's book, the destruction of European Jews, was describing ethnic Germans and not Ukrainians. Reading Ryan's book, one can easily get the impression that Ukrainians were even more ruthless than the Germans in their treatment of Jews. Had Ryan been objective in his research, he would have learned that most of the Jews killed by Ukrainians were members of the NKVD, Soviet partisans, and Soviet collaborators. And what about Ukrainian bloodthirstiness? As Raoul Hilberg himself points out, when it came to killing Jews, Ukrainians, quote, had no stomach for the long-range systematic German destruction process. Finally, Ryan seems to be totally aware of the fact that Ukrainians suffered grievously under German rule. Ukrainians were Slavs, and according to Nazi doctrine, Slavs were Untermenschen, who were to be exploited and then eliminated. Some 1.5 million Ukrainians were shipped to Germany as slave laborers during the war, and an additional 3.9 million Ukrainians, including 0.9 million Jews, were civilian victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Nor does Ryan seem to be aware of the Ukrainian underground, the UPA, which fought so valiantly against Nazi oppression. Conservatively estimated to be a force of some 40,000 by the Germans themselves, the Ukrainian UPA represented a resistance movement on a par with any partisan group then operating in Nazi-occupied Europe. Even the celebrated French underground had no more than 45,000 resistance fighters in the whole of France prior to the June 1944 Allied invasion of Europe. Because I consider it an abomination that some Ukrainians were involved in slaughtering Jews simply because they were Jews, I was prepared to accept OSI evidence against those Ukrainians Ryan chose to prosecute at face value. I was ready to applaud OSI's work in exposing Ukrainian mass murderers, because Ukrainians who commit heinous crimes should never find sanctuary in our community. Having read Ryan's book, however, I now have more questions than answers. If Ryan can be so wrong, so biased, so tendentious about so many historical events, how right can he be about Ukrainian, quote, Nazis? If Ryan chose to ignore, suppress, or distort so much evidence regarding all Ukrainians, how can we believe in his integrity regarding some Ukrainians? In writing his book, Ryan had it within his power to finally put to rest Ukrainian-American concerns regarding what they believe is the beginning of a vicious Soviet disinformation campaign aimed at defaming the entire Ukrainian-American community. That he failed to do so discredited him, the OSI, and the Department of Justice. Ryan, as you may know, is no longer with the OSI. He is now traveling around the U.S., appearing on various talk shows and being interviewed extensively by national newspapers. I believe he has only just begun. In my opinion, the current defamation campaign is the tip of the iceberg. It's an iceberg that began in 1933, when the United States first recognized the USSR, and this was, as you may recall, during the height of the famine. You may also recall that both in the United States and in Canada, the Ukrainian-American community had great hopes that someday the Ukrainians would be free. And especially in the United States. In the United States, the Polish, the Czechs were able to organize their own armies after the war ended, after the United States was no longer involved. The Czechs and the Poles were able to organize legions to travel to Europe and to fight on behalf of Czech and Polish independence. The Ukrainians always had that hope. That hope was within the context of their American experience. If the Czechs could organize legions, and if the Poles could organize legions, then why couldn't the Ukrainians do it? And they did. They began to organize, and I was speaking specifically about ODVU, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in the United States, the Hetmanchi, organized their own armies. They joined the U.S. militia in order to train young men to someday invade the Soviet Union. They even bought airplanes. They had 3 airplanes, and they were training Ukrainian pilots to someday bomb the Soviet Union. Now, you may laugh, but guess who took it most seriously of all? The Soviet Union. How do we know this? I was finally able to gain access under the Freedom of Information Act to the extensive files of the Hetmanchi, the ODVU, and the Ukrainian National Association. And in the agreement that the United States had with the USSR in 1933, there was a proviso that said that neither country would support subversive action in the other country or support armies that would overthrow the legitimate regime of the United States and the USSR. The United States had that proviso written in so that the Soviets would discontinue their subversion in the United States, which they didn't do. But guess who called the United States on that proviso? The Soviet Union. There was a letter from the Soviet ambassador stating that in the United States there was a group of people who were plotting to overthrow the Soviet Union. And these were the Ukrainians. And the FBI had better investigate them. And guess what happened? The FBI investigated them. And not only did they investigate them, but in 1938, they had a House Un-American Activities Committee hearing. And the conclusion of the hearing was that ODVU and the Hetmanchi, quote, were allies of Nazi Germany. When the war broke out in 1941 in the United States, ODVU, the Hetmanchi, and the Ukrainian National Association were, thanks to Soviet disinformation, thoroughly investigated by the FBI. It all but destroyed the UNA. ODVU lost upwards of 80% of their members, and the Hetmanchi disbanded. So here you had 3 of the strongest anti-communist organizations in the United States that were all but disbanded as a result of Soviet disinformation. The Ukrainian Congress Committee, which was formed in 1940, became inactive for the duration of the war thanks to the Soviet disinformation campaign. The FBI exonerated ODVU, the UNA, and the Hetmanchi in 1944, a year before the war ended. The only problem was they never told anybody. There was no press conference saying, we have exonerated these Ukrainian organizations. The first person to find that out was me. It took me 18 months through the Freedom of Information Act to get this information out. And going through the files, I saw letters from J. Edgar Hoover exonerating. I also saw letters from the people who were making these statements. 85% of the documentation that the FBI had came from, and they knew it, and they identified them as such, Soviet sources. It didn't make one bit of difference. In 1942, there was a book published called Sabotage, The Secret War Against the United States, written by Michael Sayers and Albert E. Kahn, 2 very active members of the Soviet-backed Popular Front. The book became a bestseller, very much like Quiet Neighbors. It was picked up by Walter Winchell, who at that time was the Walter Cronkite of American radio news commentators, and every day, practically, during the war, he would go and talk about the Ukrainians in our midst who are undermining our war effort. By the way, Michael Sayers and Albert E. Kahn wrote another book in 1945, which is called The Great Conspiracy, The Secret War Against Russia, which is a blatant pro-Soviet book. Same thing happened here when Raymond Davies wrote This Is Our Land. The same organizations were defamed. What have we learned from all of this? In conclusion, what mistakes have we made in the United States? First of all, when this began 3 or 4 years ago, began to appear in the American press, most Ukrainians decided that if we ignored it, then it would go away. We didn't make any protests. Many Ukrainians were afraid. We decided that it was much better to keep quiet because what if there is documentation there that would show that there were Nazis among the Ukrainians? So we did nothing. We weren't outraged, we didn't scream, we did nothing. We did a deep six. Second thing, we didn't reach out to other groups. We didn't reach out to the Lithuanians or the Latvians or the Estonians or the Jews to say, hey, we need the dialogue. We need to share common experiences. We need to understand where you're coming from, and you need to know where we're coming from. And third, we never clearly and unequivocally condemned mass murders of Jews who may be Ukrainians. We haven't yet really made it clear that our problem in the United States, within our community, is not the guilt of Ukrainian war criminals, but the group culpability which their guilt has visited upon all of us. What have we done right? In Cleveland, Ohio, in the aftermath of the Demjanjuk trials, which were very fierce and divided Ukrainians and Jews, they were throwing rocks at each other in front of the courthouse, saying terrible things about each other. In the aftermath of all that, the American Jewish Committee began about 9 months ago meeting with younger Ukrainians and younger Jews and beginning a dialogue. This is the only place that I know that this is taking place. I'm happy to say, and I'd like to end on this note, that thus far you have made none of the mistakes that we have made. You are outraged, and rightfully so. You are making yourself visible and heard. You are also reaching out. You've reached out to the Lithuanians and to the Jews, and you are sharing, as we did all day today, with the representatives from those two communities, what our common experiences are. And we have, you have, in Canada, clearly stated that our problem is not with the Nazi war criminals, but with the group culpability that their acts have visited upon all of us. Thank you.